This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome everyone. Thanks so much for coming along to History of Sexuality seminar, which is a co-production of the Institute of Historical Research and the Raphael Samuel History Centre. It'd be really helpful if you could sign in the sign-in book. And aside from that, it's my pleasure to introduce Richard Cleminson, who's dashed down from Leeds. He's a reader in Hispanic Studies at the University of Leeds, specialising in the history of sexuality in Spain, Portugal and Latin America. He's written a landmark book on the history of homosexuality in Spain, and most recently a book, Catholicism, Race and Empire, Eugenics in Portugal. And it's this book project, which came out last year, which provides a cue for this evening's paper, which is Portugal on the Periphery, Scenarios from the History of Sexuality, 1900 to 1960. And I'll hand over to you, Richard. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, it's a quick flit down from Leeds and back up to Yorkshire this evening, but what I'm hoping to do is to obviously speak a little bit about Portugal on the periphery, but also to hear your views on this piece of research and your views on the broader question of the history of sexuality in the southern and Atlantic part of Europe. And what I want to do is to talk about two scenarios in the history of sexuality. The first is the question of the reception of ideas on homosexuality, in particular within the work of the Portuguese Nobel Prize winner Egas Moniz. And that will be a brief introduction, a brief first part of the paper, and I think the substantive part will be on the question of eugenics and the interest in eugenics in Portugal with respect to the question of miscegenation or racial mixing. So the first part of the paper, as I say, is short, and the second part of the paper I will more or less read from a script. So just a few preliminary remarks. Portugal very often, as I stated in my introduction, which I think went on the History of Sexuality website, it's very often out of the frame of the focus of historians of sexuality. And I think that's as a result of a number of factors. One, quite possibly the lack of familiarity with the Portuguese language amongst primarily Anglophone scholars. Even though Portuguese is, of course, the fourth most spoken language of the world, with Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé, even parts of India where Portuguese is spoken. But secondly, also, I think that this neglect, if that's what it is, responds to what Boaventura de Sousa Santos, the Coimbra academic, has referred to as the semi-peripheral nature of Portugal. The semi-peripheral nature of Portugal in the sense of its geo-political position, so its position in geography, but also its position with respect to politics and the rest of Western Europe. But also, he identifies this semi-peripheral status of Portugal as a kind of semi-peripheral colonial power as well. When one speaks of Portugal, there's not that many people that either remember or who are prepared to say, oh yes, of course, Portugal had this once vast overseas empire that's stretched around the four corners of the globe. And de Sousa Santos argues that as a colonial power, Portugal was also kind of subordinate within, or subaltern even, within the range of imperialisms. So Portugal was marginalised as an imperial power and at the bottom of the imperial scale in many ways. That's what de Sousa Santos argues. I think that there have been several rectifications of his ideas, but I think it perhaps serves, at least at the moment, for a kind of starting point. So my first little chapter of my two chapters is going to focus on this gentleman, Egas Moniz, winner of the Nobel Prize for his work on leucotomy in 1949, a kind of a brain surgery used to treat hysteria and other mental maladies. Depression as well. But before he achieved his Nobel Prize in 1949, after a few decades of working on leucotomy, he also endeavoured to explore the field of sexuality, and it's this particular area that is of interest to me. He is a national character. There are schools and public buildings named after Egas Moniz, and he also appeared on a series of stamps in Portugal, and you can see in the lower right hand side some allusion to his scientific undertakings. What I'm going to focus on this evening is his publication in 1901, or the first part of the publication in 1901, A Vida Sexual, The Sexual Life, a volume that came out as a result of his doctoral thesis that eventually was made into two parts, and that they clubbed together to form a single volume on the sexual life. And I'll say a little bit more about his book in a few moments. What I'd like to do first is just to perhaps contextualise very, very briefly. I realise there may not be many Portuguese speakers here, so I'll go over this part quite rapidly. But in order to situate his work in 1901 on the sexual life, there are a few other pieces of sexology that were indebted in many ways to European models that came out before his own work. Ferraz de Macedo, a book on prostitution in Rio, prophylaxis of syphilis, for example, in 1873. Another volume by Ferraz de Macedo on sodomites, pathology and crime in 1902. A broader volume by Adelino Silva. Most of these are medical figures or medico-legal figures. Adelino Silva's book in 1896 on sexual inversion. 1922, a volume by Camilo Monteiro on Sapphic and Socratic love, which is a good read, I can promise you. And a rather remarkable piece that was published in 1926 by a medico-legal doctor, Asdrubal Antonio de Aguiar, Evolution of Pederasty and Lesbianism in Europe. And this was a vast piece of work that was published in the Journal of the Archive of the University of Lisbon in 1926, and it was nearly 300 pages long, and it goes into the historic manifestations of lesbianism and pederasty, and then goes through all the theories that were available, and the Aguiar certainly accumulated many, all the theories that were available on sexual deviant, in inverted commas, in the period. And it really is an extraordinary piece of work. I was almost going to bring it with me to show you it, but I thought it's too much weight to travel on the train with. But it really is a remarkable volume. And then later, in the 1940s, Luís Duarte's Sexual Inversion, or Inverted Sex, Considerations on Homosexuality. And perhaps what's interesting about these works is that, like many other European scenarios, and certainly like the Spanish scenario, all kinds of terms are mixed up together. We've got sodomites, we've got lesbians, we've got sapphic love, we've got Socratic love, we've got sexual inversion, we've got the term homosexuality that was more or less stated in the same breath. And I think that poses certain questions about the way in which sexual knowledge is transmitted, the way in which ideas are reproduced, and what those concepts actually contain and what they signify in particular scenarios. Why was it that there was such a mixture of terms that were used? Wherein I think in other countries, perhaps in the north of Europe, there had been by that stage some kind of purification of those terms, and maybe there wasn't such a proliferation of terms still existing in the 20s and 30s. Now, I mean, I think that's a point that we can discuss. It'd be very interesting to discuss. Despite what one would like to, I think to do, one tends to see things through the country on which one is working. So it's always very useful to step outside of that framework. De Aguiar, for example, wrote the following, and again, not unusual perhaps for European sexology. Homosexuals are as much to blame for being so as heterosexuals are to blame for being heterosexual, as he stated, or as blind people are for being blind, or the congenitally deaf for not being able to hear. But this is not the case with those who are perverters. So we have a classic kind of division of 19th and early 20th century sexology between the innate or the born invert and the perverted individual who had gone down that particular route because of the influence of vice or drugs or drink or a perverted character. If these individuals practice homosexual acts, again, the use of homosexual here, quite a modern term for the period, contemporary term. They do so because they wish to, or because their way of being obliges them to do so without remedy. And that kind of appreciation, I think, also poses the question as to the etiology of homosexuality. Was this something which was innate or hardwired, as one might say nowadays? Or was it something which was so as a result of the environment or environmental factors? So to move on to Egas Moniz, this was the contents of the volume, the two-part volume in 1928. First, part one on physiology, so a quite basic guide as to the physical side of sexuality, the sexual organs, the sexual instinct, heredity, marriage hygiene. And in the second part, the pathologies, so the perversions, morbid heterosexuality, the paraphilias, homosexuality, the sexuality, beg your pardon, of the mentally deficient. And as I say, these A Vida Sexual, the sexual life, was based on Egas Moniz's doctoral thesis at the University of Coimbra, and his repertoire for the types of perversion draws quite clearly on the work of Krafft-Ebing. And I think in this sense, the volume by Egas Moniz is pioneering in the Portuguese scenario, because those previous works don't necessarily refer to individual theorists, or if they do so in passing, whereas Egas Moniz I think draws on those authors extensively and actually references them, something which some of those other works did not do so clearly. Egas Moniz argues, I think, again, in similar fashion to other European sexual models, or models of sexology, that homosexuality has existed from time immemorial. So he in a sense, he kind of de-pathologizes sexuality, homosexuality, makes it something which is natural, rather than something which is abnormal or unnatural. But he also says that homosexual perversions are not accidental, but exactly or precisely pathological, arising under certain particular conditions. And he sees these conditions as being, on the one hand, some kind of hereditarian, or responding to some kind of hereditarian endowment. On the other hand, as I've said, through some sort of environmental cause. He argues both in favour of genetic determinism, considered fundamental by Moll, for example, and environmental causes, the separation of the sexes and influences noted by Schrenk-Notzing, for example, were both deemed by Egas Moniz to be important. Homosexuality, therefore, for our author, can be a congenital neuropathic condition, or one which was acquired from the wrong kind of environment. And both explanations allow for the interrelation between heredity and the environment. But what he also does, I think, and this is perhaps what puts him perhaps in the, shall we say, the progressive camp, if one can speak in that way, is that he does try to argue that the homosexual body and the homosexual him or herself are not monstrous. He argues that likewise that there's no necessary physical differentiation between the homosexual body and the heterosexual body, which I think is also rather interesting here. He also denies that necessarily hermaphroditism can result in deviant sexual desire or practices. He says hermaphrodites can display tendencies contrary to their dominant sex, but from this fact one cannot assume that there is a relationship between this physical deformity and homosexuality. And what's interesting as well, in brackets perhaps, is that he still recognises that hermaphrodites can in fact exist. The case study was important for Egas Moniz, again following on from Krafft-Ebing and other sexologists of the period. And he goes into, he has numerous case studies. One which he relates in detail is that of A.A., an anonymous subject cited as an empirical case of a Uranian who was a liar and an insensitive person, he states, but with a high degree of personal shame about his acts. And these acts were driven by an intense passion. The same person, A.A., has entertained relationships with a variety of males, although he is not particularly constant with any of them. He has never felt any attraction towards women and has never maintained heterosexual relationships. Indeed, for Egas Moniz, the case shows how Uranians are incapable of having relations with women. And then he goes on to describe the kinds of sexual acts that A.A. indulges in. So I think the Vida Sexual for Portugal was a first. I think it was a vehicle whereby expressions of European sexual knowledge were articulated in the country. It was a volume that, under the Salazarist dictatorship established in 1928, consolidated in 1933, had to be requested from pharmacies and was only given over if one had a proper medical, what do you call it, a receita, prescription, that's the word. And it was also, to some extent, vilified by certain rather staunch Catholic circles as well. Is it merely a derivation of European sexology, or is there something else going on here? I would say largely it's a derivation because of the sources that are used. There's nothing, I don't think, particularly unique about Egas Moniz's work, but I think the importance of his work lies in the fact that his work did become a vehicle quite early on, in a sense, the early 1900s, for the dissemination of sexual knowledge. But also, I think that his case studies are maybe one of the most important aspects of his work, and that, of course, follows a long line of sexological texts that have been analysed in different scenarios in different countries. Egas was also interested in eugenics. And in the 1940s, he argued in favour of Planned Parenthood and also in favour of a certain, maybe perhaps an admission that sterilisation was justifiable. But his main work was not on eugenics, and increasingly as he worked on his theories and practices of leucotomy and lobotomy, he moved away from that field. But his work on eugenics perhaps gives me the cue to introduce the second part of the paper, which is the substantive part. And I'm going to focus on this particular journal from the 1930s, 20s and 30s. You have in front of you the references for this part of the paper. And I'm going to talk about the bulletin, the general, the bulletin of the Agência Geral das Colonies, the bulletin of the general agency of the colonies, which is part of the Portuguese Republican state. The bulletin was established in 1925. It changed name in 1935 to the General Bulletin of the Colonies, and then again changed name in 1951 to the General Bulletin of the Overseas Provinces, or the Overseas. And those changes reflected certain institutional changes that were taking place within the Salazar regime. So I'm going to speed on with the second part of the paper. And you've got this rather wonderful image in front of you detailing, just in case you don't know where São Tomé is, you can see all of the rest of Timor and Macau and also India as well. So you can see the whole Portuguese world apart from Portugal there. So what I want to do is to examine changing discourse on the values surrounding so-called racial mixing or miscegenation in one official mouthpiece of the Salazar regime on colonial matters, the Boletim Geral das Colónias. The bulletin, partly because of its longevity and partly because of its status as mouthpiece of the colonial office of the Portuguese state, provides an unrivaled source for examining how discourses on race and miscegenation were refracted through official discourse in light of shifting ideological, scientific and international political contexts. Although changing its name from the Boletim Geral to the Boletim da Agência Geral to the Boletim Geral to the Boletim Geral do Alto Mar, the journal can be examined, I think, to trace how discourses on race and miscegenation changed over time. And it's, I think, a very useful source, and a very good source for historians, of course, to be able to do that. The first period, from 25 to 35, corresponding to the first title, was a period in the journal which was largely silent on miscegenation, focusing instead on explanations of the historical racial origins of the Portuguese and on explicit elaborations of significant racial differences between the Portuguese and the colonised within the colonial context. The second period, from 1935 to 50, up to the early 40s, 35 to the early 40s, shows a conflicted discourse on the subject in the bulletin, whereby racial differences were emphasised within a framework characterised by multiracialism, and miscegenation became a topic for detailed consideration, sometimes with a positive gloss and sometimes with a very overall negative gloss or cautious perspective. The third period, from the mid-1940s onwards, represents the acceptance of the limited usefulness of miscegenation, or indeed its wholehearted approval. In this reformulation, the differentiation between the Portuguese and the colonised is based less on racial difference and more on the social and eugenic desirability of racial mixtures as a component of the reconfiguration of the Portuguese nation as a multi-continental, organic Catholic empire overseen by a hierarchical state. And it has to be emphasised here that the colonies, as it were seen as part of Portugal in different ways. And certainly when Portugal was asked by the UN to decolonise, it said, well, these aren't colonies, these are part of Portugal. You know, you can't ask us to decolonise. This is the greater Portugal. The ultramar, the notion of beyond the seas, was the idea of that was battened on to the idea of the overseas provinces. They were provinces of Portugal. And indeed, one map in the 1940s juxtaposed all these countries and bits and pieces and Portugal onto a European map. And one of the slogans of the regime was that Portugal is not a small country. Portugal não é um país pequeno, because we've got all, you know, it's bigger than most of Europe. So that was the idea. And the third period, as I say, represents that acceptance of a limited usefulness of miscegenation or its wholehearted approval. Racial discourse in the Bulletin eventually drew on more culturalist understandings of race, produced by figures such as a Portuguese anthropologist, António Jorge Dias, who I think, yes, is about halfway down your page, and the Brazilian sociologist Gilberto Freire, whereby the older model warning against the dangers of miscegenation was effectively eclipsed. So let's have a look in more detail at this first period, which I've titled Getting to Know Our Indigenous Population and the Racial Origins of the Portuguese, 1925-1935. As Maria José Vega has stated, empires of paper structure and give materiality to colonial undertakings, as well as bestowing upon them authority written in laws. The textuality of the empire, her words, whether expressed in the letter of the law, in specialised reviews or in novelistic literature written in the metropole or colonies, allows us to perceive the workings of colonial discourse. I argue that this is the case for the Bulletin. The first period of the Bulletin, 25 to 35, was characterised by an exploration into the origins of the Portuguese nation, emphasising a sharp distinction between the Portuguese, whose age-old origins are explored, and the racial and cultural characteristics of the colonial populations. The self-narrative of the Portuguese at home thus underlined notions of European distinctiveness by means of what has been termed a grammar of difference with respect to the indigenous populations, which on one occasion were described as inferior races. This period of the empire up to the end of the Second World War has also been characterised as neo-mercantilist in style, and the native population was viewed as a kind of brute resource for the aggrandizement of the metropole. Such a utilitarian stance is visible most clearly in the piece by Borges Felipe, again on the list there, on the politics to be adopted with respect to the indigenous population of the African colonies. Reflecting ingrained hierarchical historical notions of race, Borges Felipe naturalised the subaltern position of the Africans as a result of the duties placed on the white race, the white man's burden, whose degree of civilisation and progress with respect to the uncultured localities of the South made such responsibilities unavoidable. These uncultured populations were to be the subject of the rule of whites, who through exercising justice, humanity, kindness and justice, I've said that, but without violence, would lead the native population from a state of embryonic civilization or savage state to one of progress and Europeanization. Borges Felipe regarded such a process as necessarily gradual. This was because of the true nature of the black African population, which he described in the 19th century language of degeneration and racial threats as infantile, atavistic, and antagonistic towards the white race. Depicting Africans as a race apart from the Europeans, it was a hopeless task, therefore, to try to turn the black African into a citizen of today. The extremism of his views, which I think were quite rare within this period, actually merited a little editorial note on the first page of his article saying that the journal didn't necessarily endorse these particular views. So I think it's a useful indicator for us to see how that was really an unusual view within the journal. Nevertheless, the underlying exaltation of the role of the Portuguese and their historic roots as a separate race were continually underscored between 1925 and 1935. General Norton de Matos, on the list, governor of Angola, wrote about the formation of the Portuguese race out of the original settlers, the Lusitanians, in what had become Portugal. Others wrote of the Lusitanian race as an inherently Atlantic race, historically and geographically driven to expand the nation overseas. These discourses functioned to construct a narrative of and about the nation and grounded it in historical and seemingly unalterable truth. The end of this first period of the Bulletin coincided with the consolidation of both the new juridical map for colonial administration as outlined in the Colonial Act of 1930 and the new state, the Estado Novo Constitution of 1933. The desire to differentiate clearly between the Portuguese and the indigenous of the colonies, while confirming the colonial mission of the Portuguese, was reaffirmed in important institutional events organised during the early Salazar dictatorship, such as the 1933 Congress of Anthropology at Oporto, the first colonial exposition, and the accompanying First National Congress on Colonial Anthropology, both held in 1934 in the city of Oporto. Some of these events had a more academic leaning and flavour, others, such as the exposition, were to place literally the empire and its indigenous peoples before the eyes of the Portuguese nation. Both types of event were to confirm the role of the raça lusíada, the Lusitanian race, in the administration of the different whites, mestizos, and indigenous populations settled in the colonies. According to one University of Oporto scholar, Adriano Rodrigues, the result of this juxtaposition would be getting to know our indigenous populations better, banishing, in the words of one of the later ministers of the colonies a year later, any kind of hatred based on race or religion. The stage was perhaps set for a different kind of discourse, moving from a neo-mercantilist perspective pertaining in the colonies towards a rationale that evaluated the biological potential of the contact races within the paradigm of miscegenation. And I think that this takes us to the second period from 1935 to 1945, whereby the mestizo, the mestizo, becomes a resource for the revitalization of the Portuguese race. So the introspective examination in the Bulletin of the origins of the Portuguese and their racially different others in the colonies gave way to another kind of discourse from 1935 onwards. Cast less in the light of fundamental difference, some voices in the Bulletin began to outline a more positive consideration of the potentiality of miscegenation and its role within the national and imperial project. Some authors posited miscegenation as a resource or a source of renewal for the colonies and for the continued Portuguese mastery of these territories, in keeping with the spirit of the conferences and exhibitions of 1933 and 1934. That cluster of events in the early 30s not only shows how new and old positions on racial characteristics overlapped, but they also galvanised a sea change in the conceptualisation of the colonies and of race and miscegenation. As such, these events can be said to assume the characteristic of fault lines, as Alan Sinfield argued many years ago, or moments of critical tension in the discourse on race in Portugal in the 1930s. Such changing opinions also coincided with an altered institutional and particularly international political situation of the early to mid-1930s. The new scenario was acknowledged explicitly by Armindo Monteiro, now Minister of Foreign Affairs, in his address to the Society of Nations in 1936. The position of the Portuguese with respect to the colonial populations was no longer presented as one of inferiority and superiority, but, on paper at least, was to embrace equality and adopted the mission of the acculturation of the indigenous. To colonise, he stated, is to make the black man and woman equal to us. A whole paper in itself could be written about Lopo Vaz de Sampaio e Melo's paper, again about 2/3 way down, on the influence of eugenics in the phenomenon of colonization and the politics of the empire. Lopo Vaz was a professor of the Escola Superior Colonial, the high colonial school, and he pronounced his speech on eugenics as part of the programme of talks on high colonial culture at the Academy of Sciences in Lisbon in April 1936. Clearly in favour of eugenics, Lopo Vaz classified the subject of one of national importance and a topic that was justified within the repertoire of those subjects that were studied in the Escola Colonial, the colonial school. Eugenics was key not only to colonisation in general, it was vital to the psychic and social modelling of the empire. within a criteria, I'm sort of translating as I go along, within a set of criteria characterised by assimilation and by intense nationalisation. It's these three elements, eugenics, assimilation, and nationalisation. Remember, again, that the Portuguese nation was seen to cover not only Portugal but all these other territories, were to form a kind of triangular justification for imperial intervention. After a long and somewhat erratic justification of colonisation, the article is a long one, Lopouvage argued through a partial acceptance of Lamarckism and a strong role conceded to the environment, mesological influences in his terms. It was argued that a first period of colonisation was basically a peopling strategy, and it was only in a later phase that miscegenation actually took place. Distancing himself from Gobineau and any suggestion of the purity of races, Lopouvage acknowledged that all races were the result of successive waves of miscegenation. It was during this phase of colonisation that eugenic factors came into play. Nations were characterised by this process. The soma had become fixed, and a long ethnic sedimentation process had taken place in the context of Greek, Egyptian, Carthaginian, Roman and Arabic colonisation of the homeland, in inverted commas. The eugenic or final phase of colonisation began in the period of European expansion. It was Portuguese eugenics. Eugenics here, eugenia, eugenics here being considered as eugenic qualities. The only usage I've seen of eugenia as not as eugenics as the movement or the ideas, but of eugenic qualities in the Portuguese case. It was Portuguese eugenics or eugenicness that encapsulated the best guarantee of the longevity of the success of the empire. In Lopouvage's article, there was no space given to the negative effects of poor racial traits. His was an entirely positive rendition of the inheritance of the best eugenic potential in the reproduction of mestiço types. Both ethnic and sociological characters could be inherited by this process of miscegenation and by means of what he termed social contagion. In this way, the eugenic potential of the dominating people will be transmitted to those dominated. In this flow towards the uncultured elements, inverted commas, the consequences for the Portuguese and their colonies were clear. Eugenics assumes an incontestable, important and primordial value within the field of the nationalisation of the colonies. This process of nationalisation, integral to the surpassing of the purely mercantilist phase of the empire, would make the colonies as Portuguese as old Portugal herself. This extraordinary article in the bulletin traced a fine line between Catholicism, neo-Lamarckism, and a nationalising racial supremacist form of eugenics, the clarity of which was not to be repeated in the journal. The positive aspects of racial mixing, however, were not reflected in a later article in 1938 by the eugenics advocate Dr. Mendes Correia. Mendes Correia turns to the issue of Brazil and was particularly interested in the question of African slaves in Portugal and Brazil in the past for their bio-psycho-social significance in the peopling and miscegenation and the ethnic formation of certain populations. What was of particular interest to Correia was what he defined as the ethnogenic significance of the traffic of slaves in the context of miscegenation. Focusing on 18th century Portugal, he detailed the negative results of the excessive intimacies, especially in illustrious families between blacks and Portuguese, noting that it was not uncommon to find compromising twists of hair and eye colour within aristocratic families. Brazil, rather than being the guiding light of Portuguese eugenic potentiality in terms of its supposed mixed population, was in fact, for Mendes Correia, an example of failed miscegenation. Despite the assumption of racial mixing, Correia's own observations when in Rio de Janeiro confirmed that particular racial groups had friends and married predominantly within their own racial types. Such a separate existence undermined for Mendes Correia the remarks made by Gilberto Freire on the profuse racial intermingling of the Portuguese. All this served to countenance the role of whites in the country's development. Brazil, he stated, must continue to be governed by men of European faces or characteristics. But as we've seen, perhaps the seeds of change with Laure Pauvage's article and the tensions identified in Mendes Correia's work, the seeds had begun to be sown, and alternative visions on the consequences of racial mixing were proliferating nationally and internationally. Ferreira Mendes, in the Journal of the Royal Africa Society, argued that the Portuguese had a special biological mission to offer the world in the form of the eugenic potentiality of the Portuguese in the formation of the modern and prosperous South American nation of Brazil, back to Brazil. Echoing Laure Pauvage, he argued that this undertaking would entail benefits to both sides of the Atlantic. A year later, an overtly positive view of miscegenation in the Bulletin itself was adopted by António de Almeida in his view of the indigenous races in the Portuguese Empire. The end of World War II and the defeat of the Axis powers brought their own shifts in racial ideas, reflected in the thought of Portuguese anthropologists and eugenicists. Mendes Correia was one figure to undergo such a shift. He steadily moved away from a blanket condemnation of miscegenation and began to argue that there were certain advantages to miscegenation within the colonies alone, not back at home, but within the colonies alone. Such racial mixing should take place within the bounds of ethics, humanity, and the national interest. And his ideas on this subject were uttered, first of all, in an important place, the Second Congress of Salazar's National Union Party, the single party in the Salazar state, in 1944. Without endorsing miscegenation in all circumstances and by maintaining a question mark over its efficacy as a means of populating an area or as a means of guaranteeing human perfection, Mendes Correia proposed that mestiços could be engaged to fulfill an important role in the well-being and future prosperity of the nation. They could be part of the germinal patrimony that was the guarantor of the historical continuity of the nation. Miscegenation could also be useful for Europeans in climatically difficult areas. But above all, Mendes Correia argued that this miscegenation should be performed by taking into account a eugenic selection of those who would be procreating these new populations. In the final period, from the mid-1940s, miscegenation was effectively recast as a fundamental characteristic of the Portuguese race and as a factor that was integral to the geopolitical continuity of Portugal in the post-war world. So the final section, before the conclusions, is on racial adaptability, hybridity, and luso-tropicalism. I'll try and speed up. I realise I've been talking for probably my limit already.
We started about 10 minutes late.
Oh, did we? Okay, well that gives me a little bit of time. Gilberto Freire, author of Casa Grande e Senzala and many other works which crossed the boundaries of history, sociology and anthropology, had in the 1930s, and I quote here Cristiana Bastos in the Journal of Romance Studies, had reinterpreted the history of Brazilian society by crediting the Portuguese colonisers with a special facility for miscegenation. In his Casa Grande, Freire wrote that the Portuguese had a particular ability to acclimatise themselves to the indigenous culture and a particular penchant for miscegenation, the product of which were the hybrid societies created in the era of the Portuguese overseas expansion. The reception of Freire's ideas in Portugal by the regime and by scientific circles was mixed. The 1930s and 1940s were characterised by an overtly oppositional or ambivalent stance to his thought. Although, for example, the influential José Osorio de Oliveira positively assessed Freire's work in 1938, for example, others at the Second Congress of the Unión Nacional, where Mendes Correia spoke in 1944, viewed his thought much less favourably. By the early 1950s, however, with the regime sponsoring his tour of Portugal and the colonies in 1951, the attractiveness of Freire's thought for the regime in justifying its more enlightened colonial model was indeed compelling. After refusing to tour the colonies twice, Freire eventually capitulated after meeting Salazar, who had clearly read at least some of his works. The special facility for miscegenation of the Portuguese was put to test during his tour of the colonies. Within the context of the post-World War II scenario and international pressure to relinquish the colonies from their European control, race or racial difference for the Salazar regime, at least on an official level, slowly faded from sight, to be accompanied by a profusion of images of the multiracial nation, again, Bastos, Cristiano Bastos. Indeed, this multiracial nation, composed, in the words of the Overseas Minister Sarmiento Rodrigues on your list, by Portugueses de todas as raças, Portuguese of all the races, was deemed a positive reality by Freire, not least because it distinguished the role of the Portuguese in the past from the empire building of the Spanish and the British, but also because the very mixes thus performed were considered socially and biologically advantageous to the Portuguese and their colonies. Portugal was thus engaged in a grand eugenic mission in Freire's eyes, which was explained in the following terms. I quote from his The Portuguese and the Tropics, 1961. The struggle to reorganise the relationship between the white and the coloured peoples, of course his terms, by a blending of both cultural and ethnic values, which will place a premium on miscegenation, rather than discouraging this biological process, which, as we now know, can no longer be condemned by anthropologists on eugenic grounds, was deemed to be the order of the day. Such a revised version of the history of the Portuguese discoveries and the kind of multiracial regimes they had established in the colonies permeated the pages of what was now the Boletim Geral do Outro-Mar. There's two examples. First of all, the article by Antonio Alberto de Andrade, who in 1953 wrote about the traditional anti-racist dimension of the Portuguese civilizing mission. And a second example by the anthropologist Antonio Jorge Dias, 1957, where Dias wrote about the Portuguese discoveries in the light of modern anthropological theories and argued that during the expansion and subsequently there were no ethnocentric feelings of racial superiority amongst the Portuguese, and that the key to Portuguese success abroad was a kind of sui generis expression of ethnocentrism, the ideal of fraternity with others. This was part of the personality base of the Portuguese, as guided by the tenets of Christianity. Even though the human race was one, Homo sapiens, and had one monogenetic origin, each people or variant within this race developed under different environmental conditions and emerged as a result of a particular mixture. In the Portuguese case, this mixture was provided, Dias argued, in similarity to his predecessors such as Alexandre Herculano and other historians of the 19th century. This mix was provided by Iberians, Celts, Celts, Romans, Germanics, Jews, Berbers, Arabs, with influences from the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Carthaginians and the Normans. Such a heterogeneous mix, together with the communitarian and patriarchal traditional social structure, allowed for a perfect assimilation of the Christian value of fraternity. It was the age-old mixed racial heritage of the Portuguese itself that was precisely what had allowed for this in the first place. So, a couple of paragraphs to conclude. Anne Laura Stoller has illustrated how the discursive management of the sexual practices of the colonizer and colonized was fundamental to the colonial order of things. Imperial power was, in part, devoted to organising sexuality and other types of relations between races, where whiteness was a formative and formidable coordinate of bourgeois identity and European biopower. This paper has traced how discourse on race and miscegenation shifted between 1925 and 1960 within the official mouthpiece of the Estado Novo, the Boletim Geral das Colónias, Boletim Geral do Outro Mar, an important element of the Portuguese colonial apparatus. The shift coincided with the demise of the old racial anthropological model that opposed miscegenation outright from the perspective of a hierarchical order of races, and replaced that exclusionary stance with an attitude of cautious support for racial mixing within the colonies. This borderland zone between the colonizer and the colonized, constantly under fear of stress and dissolution, effectively established the difference of the national culture as opposed to the outside, and promoted cultural homogeneity inside the national territory, in this case inside Portugal. A less condemnatory stance towards miscegenation also corresponded to a hardening of positions towards the human and political consequences of extreme racist interpretations of race, emanating, of course, notably from Nazi Germany. Such a stance also coincided with the need of the Salazar state to present Portuguese colonialism in a light that asserted its moral, Christian, and inclusionary strategy towards other races, thus confirming the historical Portuguese affinity for racial inclusion and the continuity of the empire. This reimagining of the self in the homeland, through the trope of miscegenation abroad, not only performed the historical work of justifying the propensity of the Portuguese towards adaptation in the age of the discoveries as a kind of luso-tropical agent, it also cautiously rewrote the proclivity towards miscegenation as one of the founding myths of the Portuguese nation itself. The Portuguese constructed themselves, as Boaventura de Sousa Santos has suggested, as born miscegenators, literally the forefathers of racial democracy, and better than any other Europeans at adjusting themselves to life in the tropics. But such discourses were not just about the past. Readjusted scientific paradigms and a particular reading of history served to justify the continuing Portuguese presence in Africa and the East. They also served to readjust and recalibrate the usefulness of the mestiço. Now not merely a productive body in economic terms in the neo-mercantilist phase of the colonial project, the mestiço was recruited to buttress the eugenic well-being and prosperity of the nation, and became effectively a biological resource to fulfill the biopolitical role of peopling the nação pluricontinental, the pluricontinental nation with Portuguese blood and values. That this new biopolitical strategy was to be applied to the colonies rather than to the population in the metropole speaks not only of the mestiço body as a resource to be exploited, but also of the enduring preoccupations around racial purity and the authenticity of the Portuguese well into the 1960s and indeed beyond. In this way, eugenic discourse in the Boletim was articulated within the interstices of the broader eugenics movement, not as an exclusionary understanding of race based on supposed biological characteristics, offered notably by Nazi anthropologists, race hygienists and eugenicists, but as an expression of racial hierarchies based on ethnic racist interpretations, whereby each race should have its proper place within the Catholic colonial order. As such an articulation, eugenics also found its proper place, one of the few feasible positions, after the exclusionary racist interpretation of race hygiene during the 1930s and the 1940s, within the architecture of the post-war Salazarist Estado Novo or New State. Thank you.